Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I am an insulin mitochondria guy. So what am I, half of this conversation, and insulin, yes, I can talk about. Glucagon, it'll be the new character here. Before I get going, though, Jeff and Rod, thank you so much for the invitation. I am delighted to be here again. It's fun to be here now and see friendly faces as opposed to strangers like it was last year. But last year was my first time. When Jeff and Rod reached out and invited me, that was my first step into the low-carb community. And it has just been delightful. I have appreciated making new acquaintances and some genuine friendships. And in fact, as a scientist, I've really appreciated some actual collaborations that are coming from me getting into this space. So I am genuinely grateful. Thank you. So today, insulin versus glucagon. I have been following conversations in the community with regards to the role of protein. And it's been sometimes concerning when I hear the fear in people's voices when they talk about protein. And so I made that sort of an academic pursuit and decided to share with you some of my conclusions. Before I get going, here's my disclosure. I'm a part of two groups. Insulin IQ, where we are trying to make people more mindful of the relevance of insulin and health, and my most favorite audiences are the grand rounds talks that I get to do to physicians. And then Best Fats is just our efforts to contribute to this blossoming low-carb, high-fat supplement space. So last year, my first step into the low-carb community, I spoke about the relevance of insulin and ketones and the effects that they have on the contrasting effects on adipocyte mitochondrial uncoupling. In other words, white fat or brown fat. I'm not going to talk about that today, as you could tell from the title, so collective disappointment, I'm sure. But let me give you an update. So this was the paper we just published a few months ago. My students and I published this paper in a good journal, biochemical journal, where we found that insulin was basically, as I talked about a year ago, and we finished all the evidence here, or put all the evidence in this paper, insulin was slamming on the brakes of mitochondrial uncoupling, forcing the mitochondria in the fat tissue to be more tightly coupled. In other words, only use energy when you need it. That's what insulin was doing. I will give the final update next year. We will have all the rest of the human data with regards to the ketones, and I'll be able to tell the full story. So if Jeff and Rod haven't had enough of me, then I'll see you next year. Same time, same place. Okay, now let's get into the story then. So here's the pancreas. In fact, I had to pick this image for fear of using an image that looked a little dirty. But hopefully, this is the pancreas tucked underneath the stomach. And of all the myriad cells the pancreas has, cells that are involved in endocrine functions, cells that are involved in digestive or exocrine functions, we want to zoom in on the beta and the alpha cells. And these are famous because they produce insulin and glucagon respectively. And then insulin and glucagon, in addition, what's interesting is that they're produced right beside each other in these little pockets of cells within the pancreas, and yet they're enemies in a way. And they're each antagonizing the other in almost every possible biochemical event. If insulin's trying to do something, glucagon's trying to stop it. If glucagon's trying to do something, insulin's trying to stop it. So it's pretty much like my kids. Nevertheless, we see insulin, to quote Mike and Mary Dan Eads, because they said it well, insulin is the hormone of feeding and storing, and glucagon is the hormone of fasting and burning. And what that means then in a bigger biochemical sense is that insulin is a hormone of anabolism, or building things up, taking simple molecules and making them into something bigger and keeping it. And then glucagon wants to take the complex molecule and break it down, usually breaking it down into an energy source that the body can then use. So it is catabolic. It is one of those fundamental or prototypical catabolic hormones, whereas insulin is the prototypical anabolic. Now, when we look at these hormones, let's zoom in on what they're doing. Because, now mind you, insulin and glucagon are affecting most of the tissues of the body. The insulin affects every cell of the body, insofar as every cell has an insulin receptor, and glucagon affects most. But nevertheless, let's look at these three very metabolically relevant tissues. Now, you can't necessarily tell what I'm talking about here based on my pictures. So we have muscle on the left, adipose tissue in the middle, and then the liver on the far right. When we look through each of these three tissues, these hormones have varying effects. In particular, insulin is completely anabolic at the muscle, promoting muscle synthesis and promoting glycogenesis, or the storage of glucose in the muscle to be used later. And glucagon has no effect. This is one of those instances where there are no receptors for glucagon on muscle, so glucagon has no catabolic actions. It can't tell the muscle to do anything. In contrast, adipocytes have both receptors, and so now we begin to see this antagonistic yin and yang between these two hormones. Insulin wants to promote the growth of the adipocyte by storing lipid through lipogenesis. Glucagon wants to oppose that and induce the shrinking of the adipocyte through lipolysis, or the breakdown of the stored lipid. And then the antagonistic theme continues in the liver, where insulin is telling the liver to make lipid and make glycogen, or storing fat and storing glucose. Glucagon is antagonizing that. We want to break down lipid, we want to break down glucose, we want to make glucose. We also want to make ketones, an alternative fuel, if we can use that word, or just another fuel for the body. Now, these hormones don't have comparable effects across these tissues. So muscle is then completely driven by insulin, in the case of just insulin and glucagon. And then adipocytes appear to be more sensitive to insulin than they do to glucagon. So if you had a 1-to-1 ratio of insulin to glucagon, theoretically, the insulin is going to win that tug of war. Insulin has the chokehold on the adipocyte. In a similar way, glucagon is the primary driver of whatever the liver is doing. So if the liver is seeing both glucagon and insulin, usually glucagon is going to be setting the tone. It can beat insulin there, as opposed to the adipocyte, where insulin tends to win that race. So just like these two hormones, insulin and glucagon, dictate the biochemical actions in these three metabolically relevant tissues, and we could have listed more, we need to explore how do then the macronutrients dictate the levels of insulin and glucagon. And this isn't as clear as we usually think, and this was the matter of my pursuing this topic. It was to get to this issue. When we look at carbohydrates, we see this opposing effect, where carbohydrates will, in any situation, increase insulin and reduce glucagon. The textbook version is this complementary effect of protein, where protein is both increasing insulin and glucagon, making it somewhat of a macronutrient that people in low-carb community fear. And I'm not sure that's justified, and I'm making the case that perhaps we need to revise the way we think about it. And then fat, and each of these are just when it's consumed in its pure form. If you take a spoon of carb, a spoon of protein, or a spoon of fat, fat will not increase insulin, it will only increase glucagon. And that makes it very friendly to those of us who appreciate or respect the relevance of insulin and the pathogenicity of insulin, acknowledge that it has a hand in virtually every chronic disease. Now, however, one of these depends on context, that when we've put these arrows the way the textbooks have, and that's how I've done it, it really depends on underlying glycemic status. And it's insulin, the insulin effect, the insulinogenic effect of protein is heavily influenced by the underlying glycemic status. Well, we'll get into it. In fact, let's get into one study right here. Now, by way of disclosure, this was a study done in canines. But before you start thinking, oh, well, that's not relevant to humans, you actually will be hard-pressed to find a mammalian digestive system that is as similar to humans as canines, even to the point of bacteria, where canines have similar mouth and digestive bacteria as humans do. So it is more relevant than you might think. Nevertheless, challenge it as you will. So in this study, on the left-hand side, you'll see the only difference between these two instances is that on the left-hand side, they infused glucose. And you'll see right along the very top, it mentions a glucose infusion. So they're providing these animals an underlying hyperglycemic state. In the condition on the left, there was no infusion, and the animals were just simply in a fasted state. And then they had those 2 repeated boluses of alanine infusions. Now, alanine is relevant. Yes, it's an amino acid. And mind you, of course, once we ingest the protein, it all gets broken down to amino acids. So we always say, well, proteins spike my insulin. We technically should say amino acids, right? But nevertheless, alanine is why is it so relevant? Alanine is the prototypical gluconeogenic amino acid. When we teach this concept, how certain amino acids are glucogenic, we use alanine as the textbook example because it's so good at bumping up glucose. And you see that there. You see that that green line takes a little skip up whenever they infuse the alanine. Now that's all interesting. What happens then to the insulin and the glucagon? On this left-hand side, what we see in the state where there's an underlying elevated glucose level, we see that insulin goes up massively, 130 microunits per mil. That is an incredible bump over where it was already elevated because of the hyperglycemia. It went beyond that, 130 more microunits. So insulin responded remarkably to this amino acid infusion. In contrast, glucagon plummeted by almost half. Now, when we compare this to the fasted animals, look at that orange line. Insulin didn't change a bit. And glucagon doubled. Isn't that a remarkable difference? And the only difference is, in one state there was elevated glucose, in the other state there was not. And the reason to explain this, or how we explain this, is we can't afford to inhibit gluconeogenesis. Because those animals were fasted, if we had had a substantial insulin effect, what would that have done to their fasting glucose levels? And the animals would have lost consciousness. So we can't afford to inhibit gluconeogenesis. We need to keep that process going because that's the only way the animals are maintaining normal glycemia. Because of that, insulin was maintained and glucagon was elevated. And we'll come back to this in a bit with some human data. So with this somewhat revised system in place, we will look at, I'm now showing what might be happening then with insulin and glucagon in the case of a low-carb environment, where there is not this consistent, steady source or stream of carbohydrates spilling into the blood as glucose. And then let's come back to these same three tissues. So then in these instances now of the low-carb individual consuming carbohydrate, we still have the same effect, of course. In this case, carbohydrate and protein are both anabolic at muscle, and then fat would have no overt effect in this instance of the low-carb individual. Now, mind you, I say that carb and protein is anabolic. That isn't to say that you can have muscle growth and not actually pay the price. You know, you can't just take a drink and say, I'm getting big. You gotta still earn it. And then with the adipocyte, carbohydrate, once again, is anabolic, like it is everywhere. In fact, these two are similar. Because the adipocyte and the liver both contain insulin receptors and glucagon receptors, we have this contrasting effect, especially in the case of protein, where there is going to be some degree of anabolic, but also, in the case of a low-carb individual, a pronounced, that we can't ignore, catabolic effect, where insulin's trying to increase the storage and activate anabolic pathways. Glucagon is there to counter that, especially in the low-carb state. And then, to make this relevant, or to give it sort of a palatable, easy takeaway, I submit that one helpful way of looking at the relevance of all this is to consider the insulin to glucagon ratio. And this is particularly relevant in the liver, as we'll get into that in just a bit. But the insulin to glucagon ratio provides this underlying metabolic tone. In other words, it tells the body, well, the tissues, the cells of the body, what is the prevailing metabolic pathway I need you to be undergoing, or I need activated. Insulin to glucagon ratio provides us some understanding of who's sort of winning. In other words, if it's a high insulin to glucagon ratio, we know that anabolic pathways are predominating. If, in contrast, it is a low insulin to glucagon ratio, then we know that the catabolic pathways are predominating. And, in this constant tug of war, and all of this is always happening, we have this constant check and balance. But in these instances, high insulin to glucagon ratio represents an anabolic state. Low insulin to glucagon ratio represents a catabolic state. Now, one thing that's noteworthy as almost sort of a pit stop before I go too much further, having a low insulin to glucagon ratio is relevant because that is what I submit actually matters in a fasted state. Fasting has become very popular, and perhaps there's some justification. I sometimes worry a little bit about it. People jumping on a little too quickly and maybe not fully informed of what's happening, that there are some metabolic benefits, but also some deleterious consequences. But nevertheless, there are benefits, and I submit that most of the benefits occur due to this favorably low insulin to glucagon ratio, because these This ratio induces these sorts of benefits where we see improvements in insulin sensitivity. We see the activation of autophagy, which is heavily driven by hormones. Insulin absolutely clamps down on autophagy, whereas glucagon activates it. And we could say the same thing of this sort of sub-process of autophagy known as mitophagy, where we are recycling old mitochondria, keeping them healthy and viable and producing fewer reactive oxygen species. Then we have lipolysis predominating. And then, of course, what I talked about last year, we have the activation of brown adipose tissue. All of these things are happening in this low insulin to glucagon ratio state that predominates a fasted state. Yet the benefit of a low-carb diet and maintaining a low insulin to glucagon ratio is that you get the benefits of this fasted state without actually starving the body. You're maintaining this fuel intake that allows the body to continue to function well. And of course, it can function well with fasting too, but you're getting the benefits of fasting insofar as hormones are dictating most of the metabolic pathways we care about. All right, with that as the pit stop, you can hopefully appreciate the benefits of a low insulin to glucagon ratio. Let's look at what happens to insulin and glucagon when a person consumes 3 general dietary states. One is the standard American diet. Next would be just fasting, in a fasted state, and then the low-carb diet. And let's look at each of the insulin to glucagon ratio in each of these 3 states. So in a fasted state, the insulin to glucagon ratio, not surprising, it's pretty low. It's 0.8. That is a true sort of, I say fasted, I'm not talking 12 hours. This is like a 24-plus hour sort of fast, around 0.8. This is in humans. We've left the canines behind. So all the doubters, skeptics, come back. This is absolutely, inarguably, a catabolic ratio of insulin to glucagon. We have these catabolic processes activated. Now, I'm saying that ketogenesis is catabolic. Someone would argue, well, it's anabolic. It's catabolic, but even still, we've made a nutrient from it, so I could appreciate the counter. But it's a catabolic. It's evidence of catabolism. Nevertheless, we can all agree this insulin to glucagon ratio of 0.8 must be catabolic because these are the catabolic processes that are active. Now, in the case of someone consuming the standard American diet, the insulin to glucagon ratio is quite high, relatively, at around 4. This, we know, is an anabolic state. And we have the activation of anabolic processes like the storage of lipid, the storage of glycogen, and we have the inhibition of processes that a lot of us care about. We're inhibiting autophagy, and we are inhibiting ketogenesis. We know that's happening in this fed state of the standard American diet with this insulin to glucagon ratio of around 4. Now, lastly, our beloved low-carb diet. Here we have an insulin to glucagon ratio of around 1.3, a little higher than the fasted state, but substantially lower than the standard American diet fed state. And once again, we know in a low-carb diet where carbohydrate consumption is low or very low, that is catabolic. We have the same biochemical processes occurring in this low-carb fed state as we do in the fasted state. So we can say that just what we were seeing with the insulin to glucagon ratio of 0.8, we're seeing generally the same processes activated at around 1.3. And I'm going to come back to this in the relevance of this number when we talk about the ingestion of protein. But that brings me to that point. What happens then when we add protein to the diet, to these ratios? We are a community that appreciates and respects insulin. To what degree do we need to worry about the insulinogenic effect of the amino acids as a part of the proteins that we ingest? Well, let's look. In the fasted state, if someone is doing this long-term-ish fast, hopefully they're being smart about it, hopefully they're avoiding refeeding syndrome. When they eat protein, we see a change in the insulin to glucagon ratio going from 0.8 down to 0.5. And so we see this relative increase in glucagon over whatever relative change is happening with insulin. That's not surprising. That's exactly what we saw with the dogs. Do you remember how the insulin didn't change, and yet the glucagon changed substantially? It lowered the insulin to glucagon ratio. So putting this person, at least maintaining them in this very catabolic state. Now, with the standard American diet, are you ready? When this person eats protein, we see that their ratio goes up to 70. So about a 20-time increase. And so this kind of gets to the heart. This gets to the heart of our collective appreciation of the insulinogenic effects of the proteins we eat. Because it's justified, but we have to put it in the right context. for those of us who are controlling carbohydrates and have a healthy respect for insulin, this is us here. Now, what do you think is going to happen? You ready? When a person eats protein on a low-carb diet, it changes from this relatively low level and goes up to 1.3. There is, in fact, no change. And technically speaking, there's a 6% change, which means that it stays at 1.3. There's a 6% change as opposed to this 20 times change that we saw in the standard American diet. So if we put these two head to head and we feed them the diets, the standard American diet and the low-carb diet, as was done years ago, and we give them 1 gram per kilogram of protein. And this is, I'm just sort of recapping what we just talked about. And we look at the insulin to glucagon effects, we see that there's this dramatic increase in the insulin to glucagon ratio on the standard American diet-fed side, and yet no such phenomenon occurring. We have the maintenance of the relatively low insulin to glucagon ratio that we see with the standard American diet. And so the numbers changed accordingly, like we saw earlier. This substantial effect in the standard American diet-fed people who have glucose coming in quite readily, and insulin climbing, the protein simply adds to that. It compounds the insulin effect of the carbohydrate. Where oral carbohydrate consumption is quite limited, we see no such effect. Why might this be? As a repeat, in fact, let me quote one of my heroes, Dr. Roger Unger. He mentions, without exception, that the insulin to glucagon ratio is dictated by the need for gluconeogenesis. And because in those low-carb fed bodies, gluconeogenesis is important, it is important, we can't afford to have insulin spiking too high, because if it did, it would clamp down on gluconeogenesis and the person would become hypoglycemic. Now let's look at the liver and look at this particular process in just a little more detail. In the standard American diet and the low-carb diet, I'm submitting to you that the reason we have these differences in the insulin to glucagon ratio is because of the need for gluconeogenesis. In the standard American diet state, there is no need for gluconeogenesis. In the low-carb fed state, we need gluconeogenesis. And I'm saying that, and yet even as I'm saying we need the glucose, as a scientist, I only know of one cell that actually needs glucose, and we know there's no exception. Do you know what it is? Some people are saying brain, and yet I've never seen a study that proves. Has anyone? I'm putting this out there.
The beta cell.
The beta cell, it can't use any other fuel? Neither ketone nor lipid or anything else? It can. I think so. But it's erythrocytes.
Oh, yeah.
We know erythrocytes. We know for a fact, that's my little erythrocyte there. We know for a fact erythrocytes that lack any sort of mitochondrial presence absolutely must use glucose for fuel. There's no alternative. We always say the brain needs glucose, and yet, well, the brain readily uses ketones. In fact, I would submit the brain prefers ketones because as ketones become available, the brain begins using it more and displaces the glucose. But I appreciate this is purely academic because you couldn't test this in a living mammal because they would die from the lack of glucose. But there's no study that I've ever seen that proves the brain needs glucose. Can you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
I've never seen that being proved, but that's way off topic. But maybe someone will talk about that later. Anyway, if anyone knows of a study that proves that, I genuinely would love to know. Okay, so we have gluconeogenesis. We have these respective insulin to glucagon ratios. High insulin to glucagon ratio in the SAD, low insulin to glucagon ratio in the low carb. And in each instance, we have this very expected regulation of gluconeogenesis, where we have the inhibition of gluconeogenesis in the high ratio state and the activation of gluconeogenesis in the low insulin to glucagon ratio state. Now, in addition to regulating gluconeogenesis, what else do insulin and glucagon regulate at the liver? What do you think? Ketogenesis. Yeah, this beloved process, or feared, or much maligned, whoever we're talking with. But nevertheless, they both regulate ketogenesis, just like they regulate gluconeogenesis. And here, the standard American diet and its roughly insulin to glucagon ratio of 4 very potently inhibits the ketogenesis. And then the low insulin to glucagon ratio with the low carb diet activates ketogenesis. Now then, what is the relevance of protein in this process? And this is why many people fear protein, because they're chasing their ketones so doggedly that they worry, well, if it's going to kick me out of ketosis, I can't eat it. And I submit, and the reason I wanted to talk about this is that I think that leads to somewhat bizarre eating in a way, where we end up eschewing real food because it has protein in it, and we end up just adding oil to everything. And I don't think that's the best way to do it, even if there is some alteration in ketosis. Nevertheless, let's briefly just look at the biochemical process of how ketogenesis occurs. Yes, indeed, low insulin is in fact a necessary part of ketogenesis. But the other part of this is that we must have elevated glucagon. And this was highlighted in a study published just last year by some very good friends of mine. And you'll see along the y-axis, they're measuring this relative change in beta-hydroxybutyrate in these animals. And along the bottom, it's a somewhat confusing axis in a way, so I'm going to clarify it. They had animals with functioning beta cells producing insulin and animals that were not producing insulin. Then they had, within those groups, subgroups of animals with functioning glucagon receptors at the liver and animals without functioning glucagon receptors. In other words, no glucagon signaling. And then let's look first then at the no glucagon states between insulin and no insulin. Within that group, we see that in the absolute absence of insulin, we see ketones go up from the left side to the right side by about 4 or so times. A small little bump, right? And if you think about insulin being the absolute driver of ketogenesis, you'd think if there is no insulin, which there's none in those animals, if we're talking about an untreated type 1 diabetic here, you'd say, well, they're dying from ketoacidosis. There should be massive amounts of ketones here. There should be well into ketoacidosis. And yet there's just a very subtle increase. We would say that there may be in ketosis in this state. It's because there are no functioning glucagon receptors. When we then look at the differences between insulin deficiency or surplus and functioning glucagon signaling, we see that once we add glucagon signaling into the mix, we have this almost 50 times increase in ketone production. And this is just simply indicative of the need for functioning glucagon in the process of ketogenesis. And the fact that protein increases glucagon then is another reason to appreciate the protein, and indeed, even the protein's ketogenic effect. And this was highlighted by one of my other academic heroes, Dennis McGeary, where he mentions that glucagon is the primary driver of ketogenesis in the liver. But despite me emphasizing insulin and glucagon, before I finish this little bit, let me mention that there is one other player that needs to be discussed, and that is carnitine. In this fact, this was mentioned earlier. I think Rob Wolf mentioned this yesterday. Carnitine is this escort, basically, not in a bad way. It is escorting the lipid into the mitochondria, allowing the lipid to be oxidized. And just as a reminder, we must have a lipid be oxidized for it to then be ketogenic. We have to get down, cleaving off those pieces, those 2 little pieces of carbons at a time, and then that turns into acetyl-CoA, and then that gets turned into the ketone that we know and love. So we have to have sufficient carnitine to escort the lipid into the mitochondria and induce the oxidation, and then we have the magic of ketogenesis. So all of these are relevant. This was a study by Dennis McGeary in animals, in rodents, where he took the livers out of animals that were fed and fasted. And you see that when the animals were fasted, the level of ketones was about 3 times higher. That's that upper level. And in the fed animals, he simply took and fed their normal standard chow and then supplemented carnitine. Now, mind you, we all make carnitine, but there are, in fact, known instances of carnitine deficiencies where the human is unable to create sufficient carnitine for functional mitochondrial processes. So in this state, they added carnitine to these animals' diets, and look at what happened to ketogenesis. So I'm simply wanting us to appreciate there's this extra player here where we need sufficient carnitine for ketogenesis. Well, indeed, we need it for just lipid oxidation in any general sense. So these are the 3 characters then, or the parts or components of the formula where we need a low insulin level, an elevated glucagon level, and at least sufficient carnitine, and then we have the formula for ketones. Now, this is a pretty academic way of looking at it, me saying low insulin, increased glucagon, and perhaps the more practical side is to simply add in the relevant macronutrients. And I submit when we're eating a real diet and nevertheless appreciating the relevance of carbohydrates and keeping them controlled, it ends up being a mix that would look something like this, where we have protein combined with fat, combined with carnitine, providing the recipe for ketogenesis. And you might look at this and say, well, where could we get such a magical food that contains this wonderful mix of stuff? Well, it's not very hard to find it. Red meat is the perfect source of these three components of ketogenesis. Now, I appreciate, as I have been offering this version of a low-carb diet that is not eschewing protein to the degree that some people do, I appreciate that I may be inadvertently upsetting people. And so here's my diplomatic conclusion here. There are multiple ways, of course, to adhere to a low-carb diet. I kind of have two versions of that presented here. On the left, it's a version that is somewhat more appreciative of protein. On the right, it's a version that is wary of protein. But what do they have in common? They both are controlling carbohydrates. And that really is the common strength between these two. And that's the foundation that they share. And then what might be relevant in determining which of these two versions of the low-carb diet is best, I submit perhaps it's helpful to consider the underlying glycemic status of the individual. In other words, if someone is starting from this metabolically unhealthy state of hyperglycemia and hyperinsulinemia, in other words, prediabetes up to type 2 diabetes, most of the adults in the civilized world, or industrialized, not even industrialized, we have this very common. There may be justification to be a little wary of protein at first, perhaps, depending on what the person would prefer to eat. Nevertheless, I submit the unifying sort of version of these two, or hypothesis, or union of these two versions of the low-carb diet could be that the person is starting in this version on the right, where it is relatively low in protein, and then they're progressing as the insulin and glycemia is improving towards this state that is still controlling carbohydrates, yet acknowledging the relevance of protein. Now, then, what might this look like? Because I'm not your physician, I'm going to give you some advice. And I have no fear of litigation.
Just don't tweet it.
Because this is purely academic. Here's my advice. Here's one way you might do this. And this is my sort of cheeky attempt at making it memorable, and of course I'm using alliteration quite heavily. So firstly, I submit to maintain a low insulin to glucagon ratio, a person, one, must control carbohydrates. Two, a person then, I submit, would be well served by then prioritizing protein, ensuring sufficient protein intake to maintain lean body mass and healthy function. And then third, all the remaining calories are filled with fat. And so let's talk about each of these with just a moment in more detail, very briefly. By controlling carbohydrates, I do mean this very widely accepted range of around 50 grams or so per day. And this depends, of course, on the person. And that would have to be optimized a little lower or a little higher, whether the person can fudge it up a little bit. But nevertheless, whatever range they come to have a healthy range for that person, they do need to scrutinize the quality of the carbohydrate. And this is no surprise, of course. I exclusively define a carbohydrate as good or bad based on the degree to which it's going to spike insulin. And so this would be just some very simplistic version of that. Next one, prioritize protein. By this, I mean that when a person is ensuring sufficiently controlled carbohydrate consumption, there is then, I submit, a benefit to ensuring the person's getting that range of protein, 1 to 2 grams per kilogram body weight. And please, throughout this talk, I've had references in corners. If I ever feared there was something deeply controversial, please look into this and make your own conclusions, just like I've done by just pursuing data and coming to a conclusion. But I submit to you, to maintain healthy lean body mass, we need to make sure we're getting in that range. And I think our love of fat sometimes prevents us from getting that. And that's why I wanted to mention this. Now, mind you, as I just turned 40 very recently, I'm mindful of my getting older, and my kids are getting older. Our need for dietary protein goes up as we age. So as we're getting older, we need to make sure we're on the higher end. Dr. Stuart Phillips has found that, and he's really one of the legends in this area, that the older we get, the less capable our body is at converting ingested protein into muscle protein. So we do indeed need a little more. And I worry that we're sometimes not getting it. And then third, as I mentioned, we fill all the remaining calories, whether that's 1,500 or 2,000 calories, that is fat. All of our remaining caloric needs come from fat. And once again, we know this very well, and Nina spoke about this very well yesterday, we need to scrutinize the quality. And in essence, I basically say we just stick with the fats we've been eating as a species since time immemorial. It was either eat it from the animal or make a lever big enough to compress the fruit and get the oil from the fruit. It was simple, we've been doing it. So animal and fruit fats, I submit, are better than any industrial seed oils, as we all know. And so in sum, I submit that this overly simplistic paradigm of 3 steps of a healthy diet, it is, I consider healthy because it maintains what I consider a smart, metabolically prudent insulin to glucagon ratio, keeping it low, keeping it in control, allowing the benefits of the fasted state, yet without the need for caloric restriction. And then it also ensures that we are properly nourishing the body. We're giving the body what it needs by making sure that there's some focus on protein, or to maintain the alliteration, a priority on protein. With that, I thank you for listening, and I look forward to any questions during the Q&A. Thank you. Thank you.